Good evening. My name is Rebecca Taylor, and on behalf of Capstone Section 3, I'm so excited to present to you tonight this team's culmination of our semester's worth of work with our partner, the United Nations Global Compact Network USA. Our objective this semester focused on facilitating more widespread adoptions of sustainability practice among U.S. corporates. Now, I want to take a second and give you all some background. In 2015, the United Nations launched the Sustainability Goals, Development Goals, or SDGs. These goals were 17 goals that created a framework that aligned the world to a more equitable and sustainable future by 2030. So it's a pretty ambitious goal. The UNGC needed help, however. So in order to help corporates integrate SDGs, they created the United Nations Global Compact, which is an international arm of the United Nations that helps incorporate sustainability goals into corporations' objectives and strategies. So how do they do this? Well, the UNGC then, and please listen, this is where it gets very complicated for me as well, creates the 10 principles. The 10 principles are made up of the same 4 pillars that the SDGs align with, which is anti-corruption, climate stewardship, fair labor, and environmental practice and human rights. These 4 pillars map to 10 principles that, again, the corporations will rely on in order to create sustainable business practices and strategies. How we know the companies are aligning with these sustainable business practices and strategies is through memberships with the UNGC. Now, the UNGC requires a few things for memberships. The first is a letter of intent signed by the CEO of the company that the company does intend to create sustainable business practices and policies that align with these overall governing goals. The second is training that a company must undergo. And the third is to develop a company's strategy and incorporate it into an annual report called the Communication on Progress, or COP disclosure. This annual report maps to the UNGC and 10 principle frameworks, as well as is published as public data on the UNGC website. Now, the United Nations Global Compact is an international body, but in order to network and facilitate membership across regions, they rely on regional partners. These partners are usually at the country level, and this is where a partnership comes in. Network USA is a US-based partner of the UNGC and facilitates adoption of sustainable business practices for US corporates. Now, Network USA aims to align and advance corporate sustainability in the US, right? We've established that. But it's a really hard task, and I think we all are aware in SUMA of the landscape of the US, but we kind of want to dig in a bit deeper here. Really, Network USA's task is to have us understand their current role in the sustainability landscape within the US and also provide recommendations on how to further integrate their goals with US corporates. So let's look at it from a corporate perspective, and let's understand the sustainability landscape. Now, I don't know about you, but through my time in SUMA, I've taken a ton of classes that had a sustainability landscape edge to them. So I really still don't quite understand the sustainability landscape because it is really complex and complicated. But for the purposes of a 10-minute presentation, we decided to highlight it in 5 categories here. So when we look at global goals, reporting standards, ESG data providers, ESG commitments, and finally the regulatory landscape, we can see the kind of overarching components of the US landscape. To understand how Network USA fits into this landscape, we tasked ourselves with 3 objectives. The first is data providers. Now, why would a data provider be significant to corporates and UNGC in general? Well, have you heard of the carrot or the stick mentality? Currently, there's a carrot mentality in the US, which means that regulation is not currently pushed through. So corporations need to be incentivized in order to align themselves with certain frameworks. And what are those incentives? Well, if you took Econ 101, you'll understand the best incentive is increased stakeholder value. Increased shareholder value. And increasing shareholder value comes in two forms: increasing revenue and increasing value in the form of public equity. So when we're looking at this, we can see that value increases maybe from revenue shares, but lately the US market has increased in value because of actionable climate strategies and disclosures. Investors are demanding that corporates disclose additional climate strategies, values, and risks associated with opportunities in the environmental and sustainable space. So what we mean is investors go to these data solution and providers to assess and outline solutions that allow them to evaluate value of companies based off of sustainability targets. So we wanted to know if the way that data providers were assessing these solutions had anything to do with the UNGC's frameworks. The next is the sustainability initiative landscape at large. We wanted to compare how the UNGC held up against key players in the area. And the next is company challenges. We needed to know the challenges that corporates faced and how they thought about sustainability and UNGC at large. To do this, we assessed our methodology in 3 points. When it came to data providers, we wanted to understand how data providers used UNGC data and frameworks, right? So what we did is we assessed the data provider market using market share or revenue as a percentage and reviewed 90% of the global sustainability data providers market. It's about 10 major data providers. We then looked at the public-facing methodology and the solutions that the data providers were able to share, and we aligned those with any mention of UNGC's 10 principles or SDGs frameworks. Next, when it came to the sustainability initiative landscape, we assessed the landscape via surveys, interviews, and an in-depth analysis on all of the 5 components that you saw earlier. And then finally, to understand the challenges that companies face in the U.S. landscape, we interviewed 16 U.S.-based corporates and focused on resource gaps and perceptions of UNGC and sustainability at large. Now, what were our findings? Well, our research revealed that there was a substantial influence of the UNGC on data providers and solutions in the market. What this means is that out of the 10 data providers, and again, that's 90% of market cap, that we interviewed, every single one of them used either the 10 principles or SDGs in some of their solutions, which is extraordinary if you think about it. Next, we found that the landscape, unsurprisingly, if we remember slide 4, is absolutely overwhelming in the sustainability space. There are a ton of commitments, networks that companies and frameworks that companies are trying to adhere to if they're caring about sustainability. And frankly, it's giving corporates survey fatigue and reporting fatigue. And then we also found that a lot of the frameworks in the space just simply don't align. Some do, don't get me wrong, but some really don't. And then we also found that when it came to companies' challenges, there were 2 things that really pushed companies forward in terms of their sustainability decision-making. The first one was clients. Obviously, again, driving revenue. The second one was a stick, which came in the form of regulation. And regulation came up again. It was, out of the 16 companies we interviewed, the main challenge that companies said they were facing on the sustainability initiative landscape. This brings us to the 2 recommendations that we were able to outline for UNGC. The first is we proposed that the United Nations Global Compact Network USA broaden their reporting requirements, accepting third-party frameworks as well as a continuated communication of progress disclosure on an annual basis. This would alleviate admin work on both the participating companies or member network end, as well as UNGC's Network USA's end. It would also allow companies who might not be members because of the simple thing like support of reporting fatigue to be incorporated as a member. We also would encourage greater participation overall because we could incorporate companies that weren't necessarily looking for membership. This would require a team at UNGC, Network USA, to understand the evolving landscape of climate regulations, However, this is probably something they're doing anyways, as you can see from the section in E9. When you're filling out a COP disclosure, and this E9 is specific to climate strategy on like climate change and if there's any risks a company's evaluating, they're already outlining the specific other frameworks that a company is reporting on that would be relevant to these topics. So why are you reinventing the wheel? This would be a long-term recommendation, however, because it would probably need to be adopted at the international UNGC level, as that's the main decision maker for the COP disclosure. The second recommendation is the pivot of UNGC to focus on being a resource aggregator and facilitator. We wanted UNGC to create a centralized hub to facilitate knowledge sharing among member companies, increase education and training, and then also increase thought leadership and partnership and collaboration throughout other networks' commitments in the market. This would enhance UNGC Network USA's value add to participants, as well as drive a more transparent landscape overall. This is a short to medium term goal, as the changes could be implemented at a network level, as they would likely be federally or regionally specific. Finally, I would like to thank you all for listening. I would also like to thank our Capstone 3 section team, as well as faculty and peers, and we can take questions.
Hi there. Thank you for the presentation. So I was curious because for UNGC, and it seems like Network USA's goal, it's really about disclosure, right? Just incentivizing companies to disclose. Versus if you look at a data provider like MSCI or Sustainalytics, they actually assess the alignment of the companies to the various UNGC principles that you mentioned. In my experience, there are times when one data provider says that it's violating the principle and another doesn't. Have you looked at some of these data gaps, and what do you make of sort of the different alignments, if you will, that these data providers are sort of making out?
Thank you. And that's a great question. So there's 2 points to that I want to point out. The first one is data providers are often, when we did our evaluation, oftentimes using public or privately sourced data. They're not actually going into the UNGC site and pulling data. So that was also part of our recommendation and support for why UNGC would be better served as a data aggregator instead of, essentially a collector. The second point there is every data provider on the market has their own individual methodology that's specific to their in-house data team, right? And so the holes that you can poke in individual data providers tend to be the same. They're relying on a majority CDP disclosures. They're assessing alignment for different reasons. And I think overarchingly, one of the themes that we saw among data providers is they're really there to serve their clients, which are the investors. And so investors are going to have much different, just being realistic, much different reasons for why they care about a company's alignment than than the UNGC. And so if the UNGC is able to standardize frameworks or accept multiple frameworks, we hope that there would be able to be or facilitate a more standardized approach to whether a company is aligning to the 10 principles or SDGs across data providers, because we would be hoping that they would be able to incorporate more of UNGC's methodology overall than they're currently able to. Thank you.